We know that anxiety has no cure, but faith can be the key to overcoming it. In today's story, you will see how Moses turned fear into courage and found peace amidst chaos. Stay with us until the end, because the lessons from Moses can transform your life even today. Egypt was at its peak. The pyramids stretched toward the heavens, and the pharaohs were seen as gods on earth. But behind the splendor, there was a suffering people. The Hebrews, descendants of Jacob, lived as slaves, oppressed and forced to build the greatness of Egypt. The Pharaoh, fearing that the Hebrews would grow too numerous and threaten his power, issued a cruel decree. All newborn Hebrew boys were to be thrown into the Nile River, a command that plunged entire families into despair. It was in this context that Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, looked into her son's face and saw something special. She couldn't allow him to meet the same fate as so many other boys. For 3 months, she hid the baby, constantly fearing he would be discovered. Imagine the tension with every sound of footsteps or knock at the door. When hiding the baby became impossible, Jochebed made a decision that can only be described as an act of faith. She prepared a basket, waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and placed her son inside. A basket, alone on the waters of the Nile. What kind of mother could summon the courage to do such a thing? It wasn't just courage. It was trust. Trust that God would take care of what she could not. The waters of the Nile carried the small basket, a current that could have been deadly but was guided by something greater. Not far away, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river to bathe. Her eyes fell upon the basket, and when she opened it, she saw the crying baby. She, who had grown up in luxury and authority, felt compassion. In an unexpected act, the Egyptian princess decided to raise the baby as her own. She named him Moses, which means drawn out of the waters, an unlikely choice, but one that was the first piece of a divine plan that no one could yet imagine. Meanwhile, Moses' sister, who had followed the basket discreetly, approached and wisely suggested that a Hebrew woman nurse the baby. The princess agreed, and unknowingly, Jochebed was chosen to care for her own son for a while longer. The baby, who was supposed to die in the waters, was saved by an Egyptian princess, raised between the oppression of the Hebrew people and the luxury of the palace. Moses would grow up with 2 identities, a Hebrew and a prince of Egypt. But how could these 2 origins coexist within one man? What kind of choice would he make when the weight of his true identity began to emerge? Jochebed teaches us something profound about faith. Often, we face situations where everything seems out of our control. Anxiety arises when we see no solution, but it is in those moments that we are invited to trust God. Just as Jochebed entrusted Moses to the Nile, we are called to entrust our fears and uncertainties to God, knowing that He takes care of every detail. Think of a moment in your life when you didn't have all the answers. Faith is what allows us to place our fears in the basket and let them float under God's care. As Moses grew in the comfort and power of the Egyptian palace, could he ignore the cries of his people? How long could he bear the weight of living between 2 vastly different realities? The answers to these questions were closer than he could imagine, and an inevitable choice was about to transform his life forever. The pharaoh's palace was a place of unparalleled grandeur. Golden columns, immense murals, and the constant hum of luxurious life filled the halls. In this environment of wealth and power, Moses grew up. He was treated as a prince, receiving the best education, learning strategies of war, Egyptian culture, and governance. He had everything a young man could desire: influence, privileges, and respect. But in Moses' heart, something troubled him. Despite living among the gods and rulers of Egypt, Moses could not ignore what he saw beyond the palace walls. Outside, reality was very different. Men, women, and children of Hebrew descent, the same people who had been welcomed into Egypt centuries ago, were now enslaved. Their bodies bore the marks of harsh labor, their voices silenced by oppression. Moses knew he shared the same blood with them, No matter how hard he tried, he could not forget where he came from. Imagine the weight of this dilemma for a young man who had everything. Inside the palace, Moses was a prince. Outside, he saw his true family being humiliated and crushed. He knew he was an Egyptian, but he didn't feel entirely Hebrew either. This internal conflict grew each day, generating doubt, anguish, and an anxiety that seemed unsolvable. The breaking point came on an ordinary day. Moses was walking around the palace outskirts when he witnessed something he would never forget. An Egyptian overseer brutally beating a Hebrew. Moses' heart raced. He could no longer remain silent. He couldn't ignore his people's pain. Without thinking of the consequences, he intervened and, in a moment of rage and impulse, killed the Egyptian. The silence that followed was deafening. Moses looked at his hands, still trembling. He knew he had crossed a line. The anxiety, which had previously been an internal struggle, now became an external reality. What if someone had seen him? What if Pharaoh found out? Moses quickly buried the Egyptian's body in the sand, but the sand could not conceal the weight of what he had done. The next day, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting and tried to intervene, but he was confronted. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill us as you killed the Egyptian? Moses realized his actions had been discovered. It didn't take long for the news to reach Pharaoh. The ruler's wrath was relentless, and he ordered Moses to be captured and killed. With no other choice, Moses fled. He left behind luxury, security, and everything he had ever known. He crossed deserts, with a heavy heart and tumultuous thoughts. Now he was no longer a prince, a slave, or a leader. He was a fugitive, carrying the weight of his guilt and the constant fear of being hunted. In the desert, Moses found an unexpected place of refuge. He arrived in Midian, where he was welcomed by Jethro, a priest of the region. Moses was received into his home, and there, little by little, his life began to change. He married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and started a new routine as a shepherd. Imagine the transformation. From an Egyptian prince, dressed in fine clothes and wielding authority, to a solitary shepherd in the desert, living in silence and simplicity. The desert became not just a refuge but also a school for Moses. He learned to live without Egypt's luxuries, to depend on nature, and, above all, to reflect on who he was. For years, Moses tended Jethro's sheep, wandering the vastness of the desert, facing solitude and silence. But that period of waiting was not in vain. God was shaping Moses for something much greater. The patience required of a shepherd, the silence that encouraged introspection, all of it was part of a larger plan. Moses teaches us that often, our moments of greatest conflict and anxiety can be used by God to shape us. Perhaps you, like Moses, are going through a phase where you feel you don't belong, where internal pressures seem overwhelming and external pressures unbearable. But God doesn't waste any experience. Even in the desert, He is preparing us for something greater. If you feel divided, like Moses, confused about who you are or what you should do, trust that God is working in your heart. Think of something that has caused anxiety in your life. Maybe it's a tough decision or a time when you feel out of place. Faith is what gives us the strength to move forward, even when we can't see the next step. The Midian desert was vast, but Moses didn't know that there, in that solitary place, God was about to reveal himself in a way that would change not just his life but the history of an entire people. Something extraordinary was about to happen. Moses was accustomed to the quiet routine of the desert. Every morning, he guided his sheep to graze, crossing vast and arid terrain. His heart still bore the scars of the past, but the silence of the desert had become a comfort. He believed his life would remain this way, simple, far from Egypt and the troubles that had once tormented him. However, Moses had no idea that this particular day would be unlike any other. While leading his sheep at the base of Mount Horeb, something caught his attention. In the distance, he saw a burning bush, but the fire was unusual. The bush burned, yet it was not consumed. Curious, Moses approached. He wanted to understand what was happening, but before he could get close, a voice called out from the flames. "Moses, Moses!" He froze. He looked around, but no one was there. That supernatural voice, which seemed to echo everywhere, continued, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Perplexed, Moses obeyed. Then the voice revealed something that would change his life. It was God himself speaking to him. God explained to Moses that he had heard the cries of the Hebrew people suffering under Egyptian oppression. He declared that the time had come to free the Israelites and lead them to a promised land. And the most astonishing part, Moses had been chosen for this mission. Moses' heart raced. He, an exiled shepherd living in anonymity for years, was now called to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world. Moses felt small in the face of such a task. Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He tried to explain to God that he wasn't capable, but the Lord replied, "I will be with you." Even so, Moses was full of doubts. He feared the Israelites wouldn't believe him. He asked God what he should say if they questioned who had sent him. God then revealed something profound and powerful. "I am who I am. Tell the Israelites that I am has sent me to you." This name, I am, was a declaration of God's eternal and unchanging existence, a reminder that he had always been in control. But Moses' objections continued. He mentioned his difficulty speaking, perhaps due to a stutter or insecurity in public discourse. "Please, Lord, send someone else." God's patience was tested, but in his mercy, he offered help. Aaron, Moses' brother, would be his spokesperson. Together, they would fulfill the mission. Even with all the signs and assurances, Moses still felt the weight of anxiety. He knew returning to Egypt meant facing his past and the fears he had tried to avoid. Yet God didn't choose Moses because of his abilities, but because of his willingness. And finally, Moses decided to obey. This story teaches us something essential. God doesn't call us because we are perfect, but because he is perfect. Often we feel inadequate, insecure, or anxious when faced with challenges. Like Moses, we may list our weaknesses, but God reminds us that he is with us and that his strength is made perfect in our weakness. Think about something God might be calling you to do that seems impossible. Perhaps you feel you lack the right skills or that fear is paralyzing you. Like Moses, surrender your doubts to God and trust that he will provide what you need. He never calls someone without equipping them to fulfill the call. As Moses returned home to prepare, his heart was still restless. He knew that obedience would mean confronting Pharaoh, his past, and the very people who might not trust him. The call had been made, but the road ahead would be filled with challenges. Moses was only at the beginning of a journey that would lead him to witness God's power in ways he could never have imagined. Moses departed from Midian with his family, obeying God's call. His heart was torn between anxiety and trust. He knew it wouldn't be easy to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, but he also knew that God had promised to be with him. Every step toward Egypt felt like carrying the weight of an impossible mission. Upon arrival, Moses met with Aaron and went straight to the point. They needed to speak with Pharaoh. Stepping into the palace again, the place he had called home for so many years, was a test of courage. Standing before Pharaoh, Moses delivered God's message. "Let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness." Pharaoh, however, laughed. To him, the request was absurd. Why would he, a supreme ruler, release the slaves who sustained his empire? God's response to Pharaoh's arrogance came in the form of signs and wonders. The first demonstration was Moses' staff turning into a serpent. Although Pharaoh's magicians imitated the act, Moses' staff devoured the other serpents, proving that God's power was greater. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Then the plagues began. Each one was more devastating than the last, directly challenging the gods of Egypt. First, the Nile, Egypt's main source of life, was turned into blood, killing the fish and leaving the people in despair. But Pharaoh did not relent. Next came frogs, covering Egypt and even invading Pharaoh's palace. Then lice, followed by swarms of flies, bringing chaos and filth. Each plague was a blow against Pharaoh's arrogance and the gods he worshipped. When Egypt was already weakened, God sent even more plagues. A terrible disease killed the livestock, painful boils afflicted the Egyptians, and a hailstorm destroyed crops and properties. Then came locusts, which devoured what remained, followed by a tangible darkness that covered the land for 3 days. Yet Pharaoh remained unyielding. Pharaoh's resistance wasn't just stubbornness. He was being used to demonstrate God's absolute power to both the Egyptians and the Israelites. But Pharaoh's already hardened heart was about to face the final and most dreadful plague. God instructed Moses to prepare the people for the night when the angel of death would pass through Egypt. Every Hebrew family was to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doors with its blood. This blood would be a sign for the angel to spare the firstborns of Israel. It was on this night that the Passover was instituted, a tradition that would be remembered for generations. While the Hebrews celebrated in safety, Egypt mourned. The firstborns of every Egyptian household, from the poorest family to Pharaoh's own son, died. Faced with this tragedy, Pharaoh finally relented. He ordered the Israelites to leave, pleading with them to take everything and depart in peace. After years of slavery, the Hebrew people were finally set free, carrying with them not only their possessions but also the lesson that the God of Israel was the one true Lord. The story of the plagues teaches us that God is sovereign, even when everything seems lost. Often, we face pharaohs in our lives, challenges that seem insurmountable, situations that refuse to change. But God shows us that He can intervene in extraordinary ways, in His time and in His way. If today you face something that seems impossible, remember that God is greater than any obstacle. As the Israelites walked toward freedom, their joy was accompanied by new uncertainty. They had escaped Egypt, but they had not yet reached the promised land. On the journey ahead, they would need to learn to trust God fully. After all, the journey was far from over. The people of Israel were walking toward freedom, leaving behind Egypt and years of slavery. There was a mixture of joy and anxiety. They carried with them God's promise, but also the weight of uncertainty. After all, where were they going? What would life outside Egypt be like? Moses led the multitude, trusting that God would show the way, but the next trial was about to test their faith in unimaginable ways. It didn't take long for Pharaoh to change his mind. He realized the impact of the Hebrews' departure on Egypt. Losing slaves meant weakening both his economy and his authority. Enraged, he gathered his army, including chariots of war, and set out to pursue the people. It was a spectacle of military power, with soldiers determined to bring the slaves back. The Israelites reached the shores of the Red Sea, and the sight was terrifying. Ahead of them, a vast body of water blocked their path. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was closing in fast. Despair gripped the crowd. Cries of fear echoed everywhere. "Why did you bring us here, Moses? To die in the desert? Wouldn't it have been better for us to remain slaves in Egypt?" Anxiety turned into panic. Moses, however, did not waver. He looked to the heavens and cried out to God, seeking guidance. God's response was clear. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to move forward." Imagine the impact of that command. How could they march toward a sea? But Moses knew that God had not freed them only to abandon them. With renewed faith, Moses raised his staff over the waters, and one of the greatest miracles in history took place. A powerful wind began to blow, dividing the waters of the Red Sea and creating a dry path between two immense walls of water. God had made a way where there was none. The people, still in awe, began to cross. Children, the elderly, entire families crossed the sea in haste, while the Egyptian army continued its pursuit. But the Egyptians did not retreat. They entered the dry path through the sea, determined to catch the Hebrews. Then God intervened again. He confused the Egyptians, causing their chariots to become stuck in the ground. When the last Hebrew safely reached the other side, Moses once again stretched out his staff, and the waters returned to their place. Pharaoh's army was completely destroyed. On the opposite shore, the people of Israel witnessed God's power in an undeniable way. The sea had closed over the Egyptians, but they were safe. The crowd broke into songs and dances. Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women in a victory song. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The miracle of the Red Sea was not just an epic event. It was a lesson in faith. God showed that even when we are cornered and see no way out, He can open paths where we see none. It is a powerful reminder that in the face of the impossible, the best thing we can do is trust and take the next step. Think about a moment in your life when you felt surrounded, with no options. Perhaps it was a difficult decision or a problem that seemed unsolvable. God invites us to march forward, even when the path seems impossible. He specializes in turning insurmountable barriers into testimonies of victory. As the people of Israel rejoiced in their freedom and God's protection, a new phase of their journey lay ahead. The desert stretched out before them, filled with challenges that would test their faith even more deeply. They had crossed the sea, but the real lessons were just beginning. The people of Israel had crossed the Red Sea. On the other side, they celebrated God's victory with songs and dances. It was a moment of joy and relief. After all, they were finally free from Egypt's oppression. But the journey was just beginning. Ahead of them stretched the desert, a barren, challenging place full of lessons that would test their faith. The first challenge came quickly. The water they found in the desert was bitter and undrinkable. The people, who had just sung of God's greatness, now complained. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, Moses? To die of thirst here." Anxiety and doubt spread. Moses, instead of despairing, cried out to God. And God responded, showing him a piece of wood that, when thrown into the water, made it sweet and drinkable. This was the first of many miracles that would teach the people that God is faithful, even when situations seem impossible. As the days passed, the people began to feel hungry. The provisions they had brought from Egypt ran out, and the complaints returned. Once again, Moses brought the problem to God, and God provided. At night, quail came to the camp, and in the morning, a mysterious food covered the ground. They called it manna, which means, "What is this?" It was bread sent from God. Every day, except on the Sabbath, manna would fall, and each person gathered enough for their family. God was teaching the people to depend on Him daily, showing that He always provides for our needs. But the desert was not just a place of provision. It was also a place of learning. On Mount Sinai, God called Moses to the summit where He gave the 10 Commandments. These commandments were more than laws. They were a covenant, a promise between God and His people. God wanted Israel not only to be free but also to be a holy people dedicated to Him. While Moses was on the mountain, something tragic happened in the camp. The people, impatient with his absence, built a golden calf to worship. It was a moment of betrayal, where anxiety led the people to seek answers in something visible instead of trusting the invisible God who had already done so much for them. When Moses descended and saw the calf, his indignation was immense. But instead of abandoning the people, he interceded for them, pleading with God for mercy and a second chance. This act of Moses teaches us something powerful. True leadership is about interceding and guiding even when people fail. God heard Moses and renewed his covenant with the people. Despite their shortcomings, God continued to walk with Israel, guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The journey through the desert reminds us that freedom does not mean the absence of challenges, but rather the opportunity to trust God at every step. God not only freed Israel from Egypt, he shaped them in the desert, teaching them how to live as his people. Many times we face our own deserts, moments of scarcity, doubt, and anxiety. But it is in these moments that God teaches us the deepest lessons about dependence, faith, and provision. Think about your life now. Perhaps you are going through a personal desert. It could be financial difficulties, health issues, or even a period of uncertainty. Just as God cared for the people of Israel in the desert, he is caring for you. Trust that, even when it seems there's no way out, God is working for you. And now, a question. What has Moses' story in the desert taught you? Comment below on which lesson touched your heart the most. I'd love to know how you apply faith in your daily life and, who knows, share your reflections in future videos. If you enjoyed the series on Moses and want to hear more incredible Bible stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you won't miss a thing. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might need a little more faith and hope. After all, this story might change lives. Maybe even the life of someone you love. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Remember, just as God was with Moses, he is also with you. Stay blessed and connected with the wisdom of the Word.